Okay, just one moment here. I want to make sure we've got everybody. Okay, so good afternoon. For the record, my name is Alan Lilly, presiding hearing officer of the State Water Resources Control Board's Administrative Hearings Office. This is the continuation of my office's hearing in the court's reference to the State Water Board in the City of Marina versus RMC Lonestar case. And today is December 15, 2022, and it's just after 1:30 in the afternoon. The appearances appear to be the same as before. So unless there are any, don't see any new appearances, so I don't think we need to go over appearances again. So where I would like to start this afternoon, when we finished yesterday, I asked the parties to make, or the parties' attorneys to make arrangements so that their technical expert witnesses would confer with one another this morning and hopefully reach some consensus on some of these issues regarding, in particular, the North Marina groundwater model 2022, and to the extent relevant, also the Salinas Valley groundwater model 2022. So I'm going to just start there. Would anyone, either an attorney or one of the technical experts, like to report, first of all, did you meet? And second of all, which I hope you did, and if you did, do you have anything to report from that? That the agreement was that it would be candid discussions and you would only report out what all parties agreed would be reported out. So with that caveat, does anyone want to report anything to us right now?
Well,
Go ahead.
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, Mr. Kincaid, you and Mr. Leffler hit the on at the same time. So Mr. Kincaid, why don't you go first and then we'll shift. I mean, it doesn't matter to me, but you might as well go first, Dr. Kincaid, and then we'll shift over to Mr. Leffler.
Okay, thank you. I actually, Mr. Leffler had compiled some notes, and so I mean, it'd probably be easier for him to go through those notes, but I was just going to respond that yes, we did meet, and I believe it was a productive meeting. We talked about several topics. I'm not sure that we reached agreement on all of those topics, and in fact, at least on one we had to agree to disagree. But I think there were components. There were certain things that were at least agreeable that we talked about. Fundamentally, we talked about changes that would be needed to be made, structural changes to the model that would be needed in order for, let's just say, all parties to at least agree that we were working on a acceptable conceptualization, or I think as you put it, a consensus model for decision making.
Okay.
And some of those structural components, I think we agreed that in order to render all of those structural components, that it would be would require making material changes to the model and then recalibrating the model. And I guess I will be the bearer of bad news for you in that effort. I think there was a consensus that effort would take some time, and that
Can you, as we
Yes.
lawyers say, can you quantify that?
I'm actually not sure that we are agreed on a date, but our concern is we definitely, I think, agreed that in order to make all of those changes that we talked about and produce a new consensus transient version of the model, that it is likely that we would need to go longer than the March deadline that you have been operating under, and that perhaps we, I think, agreed that we could get to a point by mid-April. But Mr. Leffler, feel free to correct me if I'm overstating on that. But we also agreed to try to work together in order to get there. And I think that we all agreed that at very least, one of the primary objectives would be to agree ahead of time on the major structural components of the model. For instance, the hydrostratigraphy and the boundaries, so that we don't end up sort of back here again after the process is completed, and that we would be in a position, even if we pursued the modeling results independently, we would be in a position to deliver to you some kind of comparisons that are fairly close to apples and apples, as opposed to, you know, fundamentally different models and different conceptualizations of the system.
Okay. Well, that's generally good news. Before I get to you, Mr. Loeffler, I'm going to throw out two reactions. Number one, you know, as I said yesterday, I have instructions from 5 water board members, 1 water board executive director, and 1 judge to keep this moving along. But having said that, as I said yesterday, the value of a consensus model in this proceeding would be tremendous. There's no doubt about that. And so I wouldn't want to, I'll say, miss that opportunity just because of my view of a time schedule. And if necessary, I will provide a report to the water board and the court. Of course, it becomes public record when I do that, so you'll all see it, explaining why it's taking longer and why I think that's a good idea. And I suspect I won't get any pushback on that. Having said that, although I would like to hear progress reports, I don't want to just say, come back in the middle of April and tell me where you are, because it might be that around the end of December, you decided that there was an impasse on some of, and I'm not blaming you, Dr. Kincaid, you're just the messenger here. But obviously, if there's an impasse, I want to know about it right away so we can go forward. So that's point one. And then the other point is, and I don't know if this makes a difference on the timing, but I instinctively said yesterday that I thought a transient model was preferable to a steady state model. Just because, well, it just sort of seems obvious that it can reflect the changes over time. And certainly that's what I'm used to with surface water models, where perhaps the month-to-month and year-to-year variations are more significant because they manifest themselves right away. But since then, I did talk with Ms. Graciano and Mr. Woolridge, and they both explained to me basically that the steady state model may be acceptable here, because in fact, what we're looking for are the overall impacts of the CalAm project. We don't really care about the impacts that are simulated to occur month by month. We care about the overall impacts, and that's the way the court's questions are phrased. So before we get to you, Mr. Loeffler, I'm going to turn back to you, Dr. Kincaid. Would it be any faster if I went back on what I said yesterday about the desire for a transient model, and instead said if the parties agree that a steady state model makes sense here, we could do that? Because as I say, my technical experts have explained to me, which I didn't understand, that could considerably simplify the modeling work. So do you have an answer to my question about that?
Yes, I have an answer, and the answer is yes.
Okay.
I believe the process would be considerably faster if we focused on a steady state. I believe also that we are in broad agreement that statement is true, that we could get to an answer much faster in steady state. I also believe that we're in a broad agreement that at most a transient version of a transient calibration, there's value in a transient calibration, and then a shift from there to a steady state model to render predicted impacts to do the scenario analyses. And then I will further state that there is disagreement amongst us as to the need for the transient calibration. And I would just, I guess I could leave it there, but I guess I'll go ahead and own that. I personally believe that we can achieve, I'm a believer in these instances and what I call the 80-20 rule, right? So I think that we can achieve 80% of the benefit with a steady state model. I believe it's possible to develop a fairly rigorous steady state calibration, capitalizing on the drawdown observed at the test slant well, and that in doing so, we could get to the finish line quite a bit faster. And I also agree with you that and your experts that the questions we are asking that have been posed and the concerns that have been posed about the potential impacts are steady state by their nature. And
Okay.
with that, I should back away and give my colleagues a chance, because I like I said, I know we are in disagreement on at least that last point.
Yeah, well, and so as I say, I'm glad I was able to get technical advice. This is the danger of me trying to make assumptions about technical work. Often I think I know something and I don't, and here was the case. But I was going to ask again. I'll get to you, Mr. Leffler. Don't worry, and to everyone else, frankly. But I mean, Dr. Kincaid, this is very helpful, and I understand you're parsing between reports on consensus and reports on your views, and I appreciate your making those distinctions. But that was something I was wondering about, and you were alluding to it just when I was going to ask you. It seemed like because the slant well testing occurred for roughly 3 years, and only 3 years, that there needed to be some kind of I'm going to use rough terms here, transient calibration process to get those data. And it sounds like you're saying that might not be the case. So can you just explain to me where you are on how 3 years of clearly very important data, because that was the test slant well, how that can fit into a calibration process if you're doing a steady state model?
Yes, sir. So the test slant well period, there are conditions, hydrologic conditions associated with that period. So without getting super far into the details, let's just say that we could average the hydrologic conditions during that period and use that as our our boundary conditions and our estimation of recharge and other forces during that period, and then calibrate to the drawdown that was measured at the observation wells in that period. And because the test slant well operated for such a long time, I think it's reasonable to presume that the drawdown, it was a steady state drawdown. And so if our steady state model can reasonably match that observed drawdown, then I believe that lends quite a bit of confidence to the prediction at that point.
Okay, so the period was long enough. I hesitate to call it equilibrium, but you think the condition stabilized because the drawdown was long, or the pump test was long enough for conditions to stabilize?
That is in essence, yes, what I believe is, and again, you know, I guess in the absolute perfect world, yeah, we would develop a transient calibration to the transient response, but I think that we can approximate that reasonably with the steady state process focused on the drawdown that was observed over that duration of a period.
So would that be the only calibration period, or would you also do a calibration for a period outside of the test 12 period?
So in my experience, what we've done, and I think what could be appropriate here, is what I call a dual steady state calibration.
Okay.
So you develop a data set that's representative of let's call it end member conditions. So like a high water condition and a low water condition. Again, those conditions would be hypothesized average, conditions associated with a overall very wet period and an overall very dry period, and then simultaneously calibrate to both of those. Absent that, my tendency would be to calibrate to a single steady state period that is inclusive of the drawdown. And the second one, or the one I spoke of first, the dual, it would be a more rigorous. The purpose of that is to approximate the transient the rigor of a transient calibration without having to go all the way there. And I guess, to be clear, from my perspective, one of the huge benefits of staying in steady state are the model run times. So the runtime for a large transient model is on the order of hours, which pragmatically means that you can expect to be able to, if you have one computer, let's use that as a metric, you can make one change a day in terms of trying to evaluate different configurations on your effort to achieve calibration. Whereas in the steady state, you can make several changes a day, just due to the differential run times. The steady state expectation of the steady state would be that it would run in minutes or even faster.
Okay, well, it doesn't, as I did the math, 100 years at 12 months is 1,200 time steps for the transient model. I don't know if it's that simple, but that's
pretty, yes, it is.
I had, back in the day, back when we used punch cards, we may
Yeah.
not even know what those are. I spent
I
lots
do.
of time in the computer center, so I'm familiar with burdening slower computers.
Yes.
I better not start talking, or I'll just say we used to have computers the size of large rooms that
Yeah.
probably had less computing capability than your laptop has now, but that's,
Yeah.
I'm showing my age. But so just to clarify one thing, I'm sort of hearing on the steady state calibration, I did get the dual steady state calibration, low water and high water calibration, but how does that fit in with calibration during the slant well test period? Would that be a third calibration?
I'm not sure about that, to be honest with you. I'd have to look at that. I think
Okay.
the priority would be to calibrate to the test slant well period, because that's that's a major, that's one of the major questions at issue here. If we could develop a second calibration period that represented some different, rather higher or lower target value to meet, to get to, I think there would be value in that in terms of conveyance of confidence or reliability at the end. I don't know if we did 3. I mean, it starts to getting on towards just doing the transient model at that point.
Okay, so my last question, I think, for now, is how much time would that save if the technical experts agreed to basically do the largely steady state, it sounds like almost exclusively steady state process that you're talking about, as opposed to a transient modeling process?
I hesitate to speak for my colleagues, but I believe on the order of a month, could be saved by focusing on steady state.
Okay, well, I mean, if just from what you described for the model runs, I can understand that. It certainly makes sense. So, okay, so let me go. I saw Mr. Durbin, you raised your hand, but I want to get to Mr. Loeffler now on big picture before we get into more details, which as necessary we can. But Mr. Loeffler, I appreciate the report from Dr. Kincaid, and you said, or he said, you had taken notes. So what would you like to provide a follow-up or report or additional comments?
Yeah, so thank you, Mr. Lilly. I think what I'd like to do is just so we're all on the same page, just kind of give you a list of the key items we talked about, and I'll characterize these as, the concerns or issues that the other experts have raised for MCWD and City of Marina, and that I was just trying to compile a list, make sure we all understand. I don't think there are any surprises here. But I just wanted to kind of go through that list, and then we could talk about, some of the key ones here that we've already touched on. But I'll preface that by saying I might say there were perhaps more points of disagreement than Mr. Kincaid had characterized. I think some of those points of disagreement are on maybe the need to do certain things and whether that would really make much difference. But that kind of goes to it's not necessarily that we couldn't do it. It's just something that would take time to do and, extend out the timeline and, may or may not, make much difference. But with those caveats, I'll start with the first item I guess we sort of called model configuration, but what that really goes to is one of the items, I think it was a Mr. Bouchard's email yesterday, about how you characterize ModFlow model layers as being confined or unconfined. And it really pertains to model layer 2 in particular. So I'll just go through the list of items. That's the first one. The second one is recharge rates, which there's been much discussion of, in this hearing. The third item, also related to recharge, is the method of implementation of the recharge, the use of the injection wells versus the recharge package. Item 4 is stratigraphy / model layering, and whether there's a need to, add additional model layers, in particular, perhaps in the 180-foot aquifer. Item 5 item 4, that I believe that was raised in Mr. Bouchard's email, with regard to model layers.
I did have that in my notes. It's basically, do you need to split up the 180 aquifer into 2 model layers?
Right.
Anyway, go ahead.
And then item 5 is model calibration, which of course we've had much discussion of that item in the hearing to date. Item 6 is the hydraulic conductivity zonation, or the K values, which again, much discussion in the testimony on that. Item 7 is the southern model boundary issue and the potential or need for extending that further south. That's item 7. And then item 8 is sort of what we call the model representation of salinity / the variable density effects / seawater intrusion front. So that's, kind of issue number 8. And then issue number 9 was model uncertainty and the potential need for quote unquote error bars on model predictions. So those are I think essentially the 9 items that the experts for Marina Coast and City of Marina sort of identified. And then, so on some of those items, we had, quite a bit of discussion, and things we maybe agree on, things we don't agree on. And so with sort of that list of 9 items, I think you could, and there's been some discussion of this, characterize the, if we assumed we were going to do these various things, that you could characterize them probably mostly as either, structural changes to the model, which are the more time-consuming items, versus what might be called more in the way of sensitivity runs, which are, a little less time-consuming. And I think the main structural changes on this list are the stratigraphy and model layering, which is item 4, and the southern model boundary, which is item 7.
Okay.
And so those are, the 2 items that kind of fall in that category. And then, perhaps most of the others are addressed, from there, or via sensitivity. And so as Mr. Kincaid indicated, we had much discussion of timeframes to do these things. And, as soon as starting with what we had originally proposed to come back in January, there would be no structural changes to the model that could be done in that time frame. So that, again, that we wouldn't be able to address the southern model boundary or model layering issues in that sort of a time frame. And so just, that's just from a timing standpoint. And then as Mr. Kincaid indicated, we did have much discussion of, continuing on with the transient model versus at some point going back to a steady state model. And I would say among the six of us, I won't say there's six different opinions on that, but there were several sort of different takes on that as far as how we would do that. But I think fundamentally, and perhaps Mr. Kincaid characterized it well, it's not like that would get us back here in January. I mean, to make the structural changes to the model is time consuming. And then I think at least multiple of us thought that we needed at that point to revisit the transient model calibration before we would consider going to steady state. Granted, there was, as Mr. Kincaid indicated, some differences of opinion on that. But yeah, bottom line is we did, I think at the end of the day, we concluded that if we were to do all of, more or less, try to address all of these things in some capacity, regardless of whether on our side we agreed that it needed to be done, if we were to just say, okay, we'll do it, that it would be probably not realistic to even meet the March hearing dates, which are in mid-March, which, really limits you to probably having to be done by the end of February. And I think on our side, we didn't think we could, realistically meet that. I don't know if we quite got to the point of exactly when we could, be ready. And I think is where I'll bring in some of the others to comment, because I think what we can do in a certain time frame is I don't think we quite got to the finish line on that. So anyway, I guess with that, I'll open it to some of the other experts. They can, if they think anything I didn't characterize correctly of the items we discussed, could provide input on that. But other than that, maybe go to the whole time frame issue and what we could do within certain time frames.
Okay, well, and thank you. I appreciate your report. Before we do that, first of all, this is totally out of curiosity. How long did you meet today, all six of you?
Oh, yeah, good question. I meant to say that at the very beginning. We met for 3+ hours. It might have been.
I can hear why. There's clearly a lot to talk about. But frankly, I'm hearing. I mean, of course, I'm not hearing consensus on everything, but I'm hearing a very constructive discussion, and that is encouraging to me. I'll just leave it at that. But so, Mr. Loeffler, while I'm talking with you, what is your view? Now the red flags are, or whatever, alarm bells are going off in my mind about timing, and I certainly totally get the amount of time to do the structural changes to the model. But frankly, if you all six of you can reach agreement on the structural changes to the model, that's huge, because then I can work with, even if you don't reach agreement on anything else, of course, I hope you do, then it's okay. If you make this model input, you get this model output. So, party A witness says I do that, and party B says, well, no, I think it should be this model input, and therefore I get this model output. But if you're using the same model, that's a huge, I'll say, variable that's been eliminated. So that's comment one. But comment two, what is your comment on the need for transient model calibration? Because I am hearing, what Dr. Kincaid said was there's some benefit, although he talked about the 80-20 rule, which I certainly understand. And it sounds like that's fairly time-consuming, would be time-consuming to do the full transient model calibration. So what is your comment on that specific issue?
Yeah, so I think the opinion I expressed is that, I think at a minimum, I felt like we needed to go through a transient model calibration effort before we consider going, if we were to go to steady state, that, we would make certain structural changes to the model, and then, go through a transient recalibration after those structural changes were made. And then if we wanted to consider, converting that to steady state at that point, possibly be open to that. I mean, I don't know. I feel like, I'm more on the side of just staying with the transient model overall, but, as a sort of a secondary opinion, at least go to the point of recalibrating the new, the new quote unquote new model that has some structural changes.
And why do you think it's important to do, first of all, that calibration? Why do you think it's important to do that calibration with the transient modeling?
I guess I just worry a little bit about, I understand what Mr. Kincaid said about the, the test slant well pumping test calibration, but there are pretty large fluctuations in, the 180 and 400-foot aquifers, seasonal and year to year fluctuations. And we didn't really get to the point of discussing this, but if you're going to do a steady state only calibration, then you have to take that full range of fluctuations over, let's say a well had, 30 or 40 years of data, and you had, a good water level history of whether it's monthly or quarterly measurements. So you have several measurements over time. So what you're doing is you're taking all that data and you're averaging it down to one point that becomes your calibration point in a steady state model. So you're going from maybe hundreds of data points that you're calibrating to one average data point. So, I mean, it just sort of, you need to recognize that, that's what you'd be doing if you didn't do any kind of, transient model calibration. And so, I don't know. It just seems like within this basin that, you have these, tremendous fluctuations and a lot of these wells, and you wouldn't be really looking at that anymore. So I guess I have some concerns about that, without having sort of talked further among all the experts on that particular issue.
It seems like that's the calibration. Again, this is me showing how little knowledge I have and how dangerous it is, but it seems to me that the value of using the transient modeling is more important during the calibration process than during the what I'll call the running the different scenario process, because at that point we really are looking into the future, and of course the future hydrology is not going to repeat the past anyway. It may be similar on average, but it's not going to repeat it month by month. So it seems then that shifting over to a steady state to determine, I'll effectively say, estimated average project impacts may make sense and may save time, because at that point it's running all the different scenarios. And if it's, you're not spending hours as opposed to minutes to run those, there could be some time saving. But I do hear what you're saying of some value to the transient for calibration, although I sure heard clear from Dr. Kincaid about how much extra time that takes. So before we move on, Dr. Kincaid, I'll just shift back to you for a minute. What is your opinion? You talked about, I wrote down dual steady state calibration and potentially a third one if during the pump test period, but what is your opinion and view about the value of doing a transient calibration and the amount of additional time, if we're talking just for calibration and not then for running the scenarios?
I believe pretty strongly, actually, that the highest value that we get in modeling is trying to understand the relationship between the geologic framework, meaning the distribution of hydraulic conductivities, let's just say, in the subsurface, and how they're controlled by the geologic units and the ultimate head values. And so the more times we can run the model and make changes, the more we're likely to learn. And so while I absolutely agree that taking advantage of the temporal changes requires a more rigorous match, the problem that I see is that we ultimately end up not being able to test as many different configurations. Let's just take, for instance, one of the major design components that is at issue, which is the low hydraulic conductivity zone between the project area and the source of recharge in the dune sand aquifer. And while I acknowledge that we may not get agreement between us on whether that's real or not, I think what is very clear is that the opportunity to test different configurations that might produce something plausible is significantly limited by working in the transient because of how long it takes to run the model. So there's a value and there's a trade-off, as with anything. But I think the trade of being able to test more different geologic configurations outweighs the benefit of the opportunity to calibrate to the more rigorous record. And I acknowledge that a lot of my colleagues will differ, will have different opinions on this, not just the ones in this room, but in my professional realm. But that's what I believe. And then more to the point, what I've found, and I believe is the case in this model, what I see often is a move to transient, that because you're trying to the benefit of the more rigorous calibration, but then not being able to achieve as good of a calibration result. And so you end up with saying, oh, well, I have again, there's lots of argument about the relevance of the relative error, but you end up with a larger relative error in the transient than you could in the steady state. And I'm not convinced that that's better, and that you get that. The fear is that you, again, are only able to test so many things before time just dictates you need to accept whatever it is you have and then come to the table with it. So that's I don't know if I'm clear on that, but that's my biggest philosophy, let's say, on the value of steady state versus transient.
Oh, you're pretty clear. I think Mr. Leffler was pretty clear either. Right? This is an important point. So I'll just shift back to you, Mr. Leffler. Anything further you want to say on this question?
I guess the only thing I wanted to add was with regard to future projections. I think it's important to recognize that, and I think you can see it in some of the figures towards the end of the August 2022 model report, that with a transient model, you can see how the ocean water percentage might be expected to fluctuate over time with hydrology. So when you have series of dry years and series of wet years, you get this fluctuation in the ocean water percentage as represented by the transient model. So, again, you'll just get one answer for ocean water percentage with a steady state model. You'll just get one value, one average value. You won't be able to see what the model projects as the fluctuations in ocean water percentage. Now so that's just a parameter, or, I guess if you could say, what are the things we're trying to use the model for? I mean, what questions are we asking of the model? And so for other questions, maybe it's like say for drawdown, the drawdown's probably going to equilibrate relatively quickly in the scheme of a 100-year, say, transient model, probably very quickly. But the ocean water percentage will continue to fluctuate over time, quite, as you could see in those figures. So I just want to point that out.
But my question was actually, what about I will have a comment on that, which I will make in just a minute. That's talking about model scenarios, model runs, and so forth. But what about for model calibration? That was my question. Transient versus steady state for the calibration work. And I think Dr. Kincaid, I'm trying to keep the jargon here, but basically testing different model geologic configurations, I think was pretty much what he said. What is your view of steady state versus transient for that? I mean, when I heard Dr. Kincaid say this, he's sure in steady state, since each run can be done fairly quickly, you could do a lot more model configurations in your calibration process, even though you're calibrating to average data. Where with transient, just because of the time, you won't be able to do as many geologic configurations, even though you will have that month-to-month variation. So do you have a comment? I mean, I see trade-offs here for sure. Do you have a comment on those trade-offs?
Well, I guess I'd ask a point of clarification first, and then I really might have to defer to Dr. Ye, since he's worked, because it really depends on the model.
Right.
But when we say different, I think, was it model configurations was the term that
Or
geologic
Kincaid said
configurations?
model geologic configuration.
Yeah. So it's not clear to me if that means just changing the values of K zones. So in terms of like a sensitivity study, or are we actually talking about changing model layering, like structural changes?
Okay, I heard it to be both, but Dr. Kincaid, please clarify.
Yeah, I think both is the answer. I mean, I don't want to. I'm just saying that we think of that low hydraulic conductivity zone. It has a shape to it, so we can test the magnitude of the value assigned to that shape through a sensitivity study. And I mean, we can test everything through a sensitivity study, but the question is there a different shape that produces a better calibration? So maybe there's a different shape of multiples of the zones that produces a better calibration that also produces a more plausible configuration of flow. And that modeling in essence is a tool used to learn about how the system works. And the more that we can run it and the more configurations we can test, the more we learn. And that's fundamentally why, that's what I'm talking about here.
So, yeah, so Mr. Leffler, what's your response to that? I mean, he's identified a trade-off. There's no doubt there are pluses and minuses between the two different methods of calibration. But do you have any further comments on that?
Well, I guess I'm still trying to clarify. So I thought what I heard Mr. Kincaid say was that it wasn't necessarily that we're changing like elevations of model layers, but we're changing the spatial distribution of a hydraulic conductivity zone. So in other words, that we have certain zones that cover certain spatial areas. So we would not just change the value within a given area. We would say, well, this particular zone, I'll call it zone 5, we're going to make it bigger, or we're going to make it smaller. So I guess I just want to clarify whether we're talking about spatial changing of the zone boundaries, the K zone boundaries, or again, whether we're actually talking about changing the model layer elevations, or both.
So, yeah, go ahead, Dr. Kincaid. I'm not going to speculate as to which of those you meant.
So I mean both. And
Okay.
I mean that, so the spatial one is an easier one to use as a metaphor. So that's why I used that. But in particular, one of the things that we talked about today was the relevance of the top of the way the four-door FOSVA is defined in the model. So that would be an example, to your point, of a layer elevation. And we have expressed the idea, which in fairness is an idea, that that elevation and how that elevation drops and changes as you move from east to west towards the ocean could be very significant in terms of its control or its effect on the heads and therefore the calibration. And so again, that's an example of a change in the geologic or the hydrogeologic conceptualization that is more likely to be able to be tested when you operate in steady state purely because of how fast you can run the steady state models. So it's not that you can't do it in transient. Of course you could do it, but you're just not going to be able to do as many of those types of changes in a transient model when you're operating under a timeline and a budget, which is, basically always. So
What we always have, yeah.
yeah, so that's to me, that's the biggest trade-off. And when the nature of the questions demand transient, then it's very clear, you need to work in a transient model. But in this case, I don't believe the nature of the questions. I don't believe anybody has posed the question, how is the drawdown footprint going to evolve over time? I believe we've been essentially looking at a depiction of some long-term drawdown or some long-term possible configuration of a capture zone. And we haven't been really focused on how those capture zones are likely to change, expand, and contract. And
Yeah, okay.
The example of OWP is a good one. If it becomes critical, like, oh, how much of a given year will the OWP be greater than X percentage, then that's by nature a transient question.
Okay, that's getting into the model runs. I'm still trying to focus on the calibration question.
Well,
So
I would just
understand.
say, and I won't talk anymore, but I would just say that if you're going to ultimately answer questions that are of a transient nature, then I think it behooves you to calibrate the model in a transient. I don't think it makes sense to convert to transient after calibrating to steady state.
So that's a good. So let me answer that question, and then maybe I'll get back to you, Mr. Leffler. I'll give you a moment to think about this question of transient calibration. I think the court's questions to the, some of them don't ask for numbers at all, but to the extent they ask for numbers, I think they all can be answered with steady state averages. There's nothing in any of the court's questions that talks about variations, particularly how much water comes from different sources. I think that's what the court's questions are in terms of. And I certainly think answering those with what they would be averaged over time will be sufficient. I am comforted to hear that the drawdown is likely to equilibrate, and there's not as much need to do transient modeling to model the estimated drawdown effects of the project, because I think that, as I said before, I think the potential effects of the Cal-Am project on the saltwater intrusion front near Marina Coast wells and the effects on those wells, is the most important question, but it doesn't sound like transient modeling is necessary for that. So, long way of saying, I am pretty comfortable, unless my technical people tell me otherwise, and so far they haven't. I'm pretty comfortable that the model scenarios can be done in steady state to save the considerable amount of time to run those models, particularly if we get into more different scenarios, and particularly if the parties have disagreements on the assumptions that should be made for those scenarios. So I think that takes care of that problem. So then I don't know if you want to say anything more right now, Mr. Leffler, and this isn't we're not going to make a decision today, but we need to pretty quickly. But knowing that or hearing that, does that have any bearing on your question of this trade-off of doing the calibration through a steady state approach versus a transient approach?
Well, I think I wanted to go back to the discussion of spatial versus vertical changes and that we were having regarding K zones and model layers.
Okay.
But before I do that, I'll try to answer your question. I think one of the concerns I have, I think we really need to get to Dr. Ye here and get his input on this. But I think one of my concerns of not going through any point of transient calibration is again, I'll go back to, you take all the data points for a well, it could be hundreds of them, and you turn that into one singular value. And there might be some discussion of whether you just average all those data points or you come up with some other way of establishing the value to use. So there probably could even be some discussion about what's the most appropriate, singular value to use there. But I mean, it's certainly conceivable that you could come up with a different parameterization of the model in terms of the K zones from a transient calibration versus a steady state calibration. So, I mean, it could lead to, a different set of K zones and values, if you do it just steady state versus transient. So I'll just put that out there as something perhaps that we need to consider.
Okay,
but
well, I certainly get that. They would be different. And you're making a good point. Particularly if the data points for calibration of, head levels in a given test well have varied substantially over time, there's certainly some concern about using an average of that. And as I think Dr. Kincaid pretty clearly said, the trade-off is you're just hampered or limited in how many model runs you can do during the calibration process. So anyway, go ahead. I think I interrupted you.
So and just, one other point, and I agree with Mr. Kincaid, we should bring in some of the other experts here.
Yeah.
But back on the issue of, so I agree if you're looking at K zones and doing a spatial change in the boundaries of those zones, that's a fairly straightforward or relatively quicker adjustment to make in a model. But if you're changing the model layer elevations, that's what I'm referring to more as a structural change in the model, and those are more time consuming, whether you're talking about steady state or transient. And I think, again, Dr. Ye can comment further on that, but I think there's an important distinction there between making a spatial change in a K-zone boundary versus changing the model layer elevations. Those are two pretty different changes, and both in terms of the time involved to do it and sort of, I guess, the ramifications of doing that. Because it's sort of like as soon as you change the model layer elevations, you got to relook at your calibration potentially.
Yeah, I'm hearing that. But I'm also hearing it may be important. So, Dr. Ye, you've heard this discussion. Do you have, particularly on this question of calibration, after making changes with the modeling parameters, do you have any comments on the trade-offs between doing the calibration using the steady state model versus using the transient model?
Yes, Mr. Levy.
Go ahead.
First of all, you are right. When we talk about the steady state, we need to separate model calibration and the model prediction. Right now, I'm only address the question for model calibration.
Okay.
The differences between steady state and the transient, for the model parameter, for the steady state, you don't need to use the storage coefficient. So that means it's going to be no storage change. So in the real world, you don't have that condition. So this will really, I can say probably downgrade the model calibration value. It's not an industry standard. So if you look at the ASTM guideline and, they talking about steady state and the transient, usually we do the steady state to establish the initial condition for the transient model calibration. Then you can pick up any USGS model reports. That's a typical procedure. So I think we need to do the transient model calibration after we change the model boundary and the structures.
So you're strongly recommending using the transient model for calibration, even if you use steady state for the model simulations later on.
Correct.
Okay. All right, Mr. Durbin, you had raised your hand earlier. I don't want to put too much of an age label on you, but I suspect you've been doing groundwater modeling longer than anybody else here. Do you have any comments on this particular question of whether or not to use the steady state or the modeling approach or the transient model approach for calibration? And you have to go off mute so we can hear you.
Okay,
There you go. Now we can hear you. Go ahead.
so actually, I want to make general comment about the meeting this morning. I came away with the impression that there can be a lot of collaboration here, and that we can do quite a bit in working through some of the things that are currently that have different ideas about. That said, well, within our house, if you want to say the Cal-Am house, we have disagreement.
Oh, okay.
So we're not speaking with a single voice here. I think that Dr. Kincaid is pretty much right on and what ought to be done. I don't agree with some of the comments regarding the need for a transient calibration. One of the, of course, on a transient calibration, in addition to the hydraulic conductivities, you're calibrating the storage properties. The way the dynamics of a groundwater system work, the effects of those two phenomena are interrelated in what they do.
I'm sorry, I was writing here. I wrote storage, and what is the other phenomenon that are interrelated?
Well, storage and the hydraulic conductivity or the transmissive parts of it.
Okay, go ahead. Go
And
ahead.
when
Excuse
you
me.
do a model, transient model calibration, you're trying to in part sort out two different processes, and it is difficult in many model applications to really tell which is more important, the storage effects or the transmissivities or the hydraulic conductivities. In a steady state model, the storage properties disappear from consideration. And I think that you ultimately get as far as the hydraulic conductivities, probably a better estimates, less uncertain estimates of what those parameter values should in fact be.
Okay, well, that's helpful. We have a few other points to. I'm just writing this down, so bear with me. Believe me, I'm learning a lot. Although I'll just say Ms. Graziano did emphasize to me that in the steady state, you don't have the storage component or the variability in storage component. Which is something I had not known before. So I appreciate that. So before we move on, this is a pretty productive discussion, but I will ask, we have Dr. Trudell and Ms. Nelson have not made any comments. You don't have to make any comments. I think we're getting pretty much, pretty good input here, but does either of you want to add any comments on this, mainly this question of steady state versus transient for the calibration process is what I'm interested in now, because I think that's first step, and it may be an important step for what's done and how much time it takes.
Yes, Mr. Lilly, I'd like to comment. This is Mark Trudell.
Go ahead. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So the main advantage I see to the transient calibration is that because it includes changes in storage, it produces more of a unique calibration than you would get from a steady state calibration only. The steady state calibration can be very good, but at the same time, it's non-unique. It's more non-unique than a transient calibration. And so my preference, and I guess I'm maybe kind of speaking the same way as Mr. Durbin, only, we don't, on the Marina MCWD side, we don't all agree on this. And I think Todd Kincaid pointed this out. I prefer a transient calibration, and maybe you start with a steady state simulation for your initial heads. You do your 20 or 30-year transient calibration, which includes the pumping test. And that's important because, that's a long-term pumping test, and you can calibrate to the entire period, not just to the final result. And then after you've got your transient calibration completed and say up to at the end of 2019, you would probably use those heads or that head distribution as your initial heads for the long-term forecast steady state model. And I think that, in my opinion, that's the best approach. Because you have a constrained and relatively unique transient calibration, followed by a long-term steady state simulation, where you're really not looking for seasonal variations in the forecast model. No one's asking the question, well, how does ocean water percentage vary month by month?
Yeah,
people are
I think we
asking,
all agree on that. That's
Yes.
not what the court has asked. So it's really the calibration is the question.
Really, so the calibration really then constrains where you go with the steady state model, in my opinion. Now, others may disagree with me, and I know Mr. Kincaid does, but that's my opinion. And my preference would be to see a transient calibration that is used to define the initial heads for the forecast steady state simulations.
Okay, well, that's certainly a useful perspective. So, Ms. Nelson, you're the only one who hasn't spoken. You want to add anything on this, or do you want to leave well enough alone?
My comment is, if we have 6 months, I totally agree with Dr. Ye and Mr. Trudell. But given the time constraint, even of April, I would suggest that if I had to choose, I would go with the steady state. So if we have more time, I agree. The transient is the gold standard, but I have not heard that from the court or from you.
I certainly haven't heard that from anybody I report to. I'll just say that. So thank you. But that's probably a good summary perspective of the trade-offs here, at least some of them. Although Dr. Kincaid, just to be clear, I'm paraphrasing, but he not only is the steady state calibration quicker, but his comment was you also can get the benefit of being able to at least do some additional model configuration variations. I mean, I heard from Mr. Leffler changing some of the, I'll say, layer elevations, if I'm getting that right, might be very time consuming, but at least changing the extent of the different conductivity zones within each layer that would be another benefit of steady state calibration, is that could be done relatively quickly to test different ones. So Mr. Leffler, back to you. Your electronic hand went up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to just sort of clarify that I don't think we reached conclusion on the timeframes quite to do either scenario. I mean, Ms. Nelson mentioned 6 months. I don't think we're talking about that. I mean, the effort that we went through to, originally was, with both the model by Mr. Durbin and the model by Mr. Ye, which included, calibration of both of those models, we did in, I think, roughly 4 months. So I mean, I would, of course, have to defer to them on more on the time frame, but I just want to clarify that I don't think it's I mean, I think Mr. Kincaid suggested it's a month less time to do what he's suggesting. And, I guess that's one input
Oh, yeah,
on that.
and just so we're
but-
clear, I didn't hear Ms. Nelson to say 6 months for calibration. I heard say if you did the transient calibration, the total process could take 6 months. I don't know, was that the import of your comment, Ms. Nelson?
Yeah, I guess what I wanted to say was if you wanted to have what Dr. Kincaid said is, look, if to really do this well, you need to run a lot of different scenarios. And if you wanted to do that in a transient manner with a transient model to get that same number and ability to really look at the model under different scenarios, then in my opinion, you probably would need 6 months.
Oh, just for calibration.
We're talking about coming back to you with answers by a certain time frame, and what we've said is, the April time frame is what we're thinking. And my comment is, even with that April time frame, I'm concerned with the transient model to really do the rigorous, hey, we want to look at this in 10 different ways, that even that April time frame is very difficult.
Yeah, okay.
And that's why that's why I believe the steady state model is more effective at getting us where we need to go, because I'm concerned that what MCWD wants to see is the ability to look at a lot of different scenarios and put a bound on it.
Well,
Okay.
Just really one quick point of clarification. I think what myself and Dr. Ye and Dr. Trudell were saying is not about running scenarios in transient mode, but just
Right.
get to the model calibration in transient mode, and then, maybe converting to steady state to run all these scenarios.
Yeah, we can close that loop right now. Nobody has said we need to run transient model for the scenarios. And I clearly don't think we need to run transient for the scenarios.
When I say
To answer the
scenarios,
court's
I don't mean future. I'm sorry. When I say scenarios, I mean model configurations, parameterization, various parameterizations, and model thickness layers. I apologize. I didn't mean it to say scenarios for future.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So we're talking about the question here is for the development of potential changes in the model configuration and the related calibration process. Is that best done in steady state or transient? That's what we're talking about here. I think we're all on the same page that is the question. We just haven't decided which way we're going to go. And I'll tell you right now, I'm going to want to talk to my technical people before making a decision on that. So, okay, so we've had a really good discussion with all the technical experts, and now there's a lawyer who wants to weigh in. So, Mr. Osias, go ahead. And I'm being a little bit facetious here, but anyway, go ahead, Mr. Osias, if you want to weigh in right now.
Yes, I would like to encourage you in your exploration of timeliness with the experts to seek from them not only the time to complete their work, which is, I think, what people have been talking about, but then they have a work product to produce. And then I believe they will want a time to look at each other's work product before a hearing starts. And so when we think about the planning and the timing sensitivities, I didn't want to overlook, I know it's a lawyer's comment, but the process I think each of them would want.
I have thought of that too. I certainly understand that.
Okay, and I do think they talked a little bit about that in terms of review time, right, of each other's. So
Yeah.
if you want to draw them out on that, I thought that might be helpful.
Yeah, I know that, although I'm hoping, of course, the more consensus that they can reach on modeling, then the less, I mean, they still want to review each other's work, but perhaps the less, I'll say, critique or criticisms there are. I mean, that's the goal here. So I mean, clearly you can hear me. I'm grappling with some trade-offs here as far as time. I mean, it really all comes down to a trade-off of time versus quality of product, which is probably not surprising. So this has been very helpful. I'm going to just circle back. We have to figure out what to do here. I mean, ultimately what we're going to do is I'm going to prepare some kind of a hearing officer's ruling or order on how I want to proceed here, but I need to know what to put in it. And some of it is going to be schedule, and clearly I would like some reporting dates here. As I said before, I don't want to just give you 4 months because there could be an impasse and then a lot of lost time here. And I do have to get this done. So, Mr. Kincaid, or Dr. Kincaid, you raised your electronic hand. So go ahead. You have comments on that.
Yes, sir.
Proposed schedule and work plan, I'll say.
I just wanted to point out, and I think this is another example of the productivity of our meeting this morning, but Mr. Durbin, towards the end of the meeting, had suggested that at the time we were talking about recharge in particular, but that we schedule I believe he described it as a workshop where we could come together and sit down at a table using data sets, not just, hypotheticals, and agree to, and again, in that case, we were speaking about recharge. But in the spirit of that, I think we also talked about and agreed that it would be extremely beneficial to agree on, certain changes and structural components of a model. And here I'm going to deviate from what we all collectively discussed. So ample acknowledgement that my colleagues could disagree here, but I think that in general, the concept I took away is that there's an opportunity for us to work collaboratively to some extent, so that number one, we get to the end of the work period with a product that is more of a consensus, which is what you've asked for. But also we might be able to do it in such a way that we have some, let's call it milestone reports, where we could say we met, we agreed to these things, and this is the direction that we're going to take. My expectation would be that in the end of the day, we won't produce exactly the same model predictions, but that the extent to which those both models share the same fundamental components, I think would be very beneficial.
Absolutely.
To you and your decision.
I'm going to call it the model platform. I don't know if that's right. It's probably not the right terminology, but
fine with me. That's good.
But yes, as I say, then if I can say, okay, assumption A leads to result A and assumption B leads to result B, that's something that's a lot easier to work with if it's the same, if it's going through the same model mechanism. It's just different assumptions. So, okay, but so where we are, I don't know how much more we need to talk about the other things today. I do think the product I need from the group, and I will say we did have tomorrow scheduled as a hearing day, so I don't know. I'd like to have you get back together, but what I'd like is I don't know whether I'll call it you called it milestones, Dr. Kincaid, but what it really is a proposed work plan and schedule, and I'll say milestones for reporting, so we can sort of see what our progress is here. Do you think you're far enough along with your discussions that you could collaboratively develop something like that and at least get started tomorrow, even if you don't finish tomorrow? I'll turn to you, Dr. Cade. Your hand is still up, so I'll go ahead and ask
sorry
you.
about that. Yes, I'll just say, I think that it would be productive to meet again, provided that I think what would be beneficial is some consensus from you or from both of our respective legal teams here as to a fundamental direction. In other words, if by the end of this meeting here, we agree that we're going to pursue a model that includes, these material revisions that have been discussed, then I think it's very reasonable and plausible that we could come back together and talk about goals and objectives in a very general timeline. Again, I'm speaking for my colleagues.
I think in order to do the timeline, and we need some resolution of steady state versus transient.
I agree with that.
Yeah,
as well.
yeah, no, I understand you need that. So let's do this. I think I'd like to just have a brief break here to talk to my staff about this and give you what direction we can right now, which isn't a lot, but I think we can give you some. And then we'll come back, maybe in 20 minutes or 20 or 30 minutes and talk about moving forward. But what I would like is for you all to be considering, you can talk during the break with your attorneys or with each other as you deem appropriate, as to what sort of I'm going to call it a proposed work plan and schedule with reporting milestones. Is that okay? I mean, I think that, because I don't know enough yet to say what goes where in that, but basically for the ultimate product, well, there'd be a couple of products along the way. Hopefully some kind of, I'm going to call them consensus reports on what you've agreed to with modeling parameters and what you've done for calibration. And then at that point, if necessary, you can be going your separate ways to prepare your own modeling runs and reports from those. And the products from those then would be what you would submit for additional hearing days. And so I'd like to know what your schedule is for doing that much. And then I am in tune with Mr. Osias's comment that you probably want to review each other's reports and submit some kind of responses to those. And at that point, we may be able to just do it orally. We may not have to have you write that up if that would save time. We don't have to have all rebuttal testimony in writing. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it takes more time. So that's what I'm looking for. So why don't you all think about that while I'm caucusing with my staff about where, what direction I think we can give you today, and we'll go forward from there. So it's 2:52 right now. Let's go ahead. This may take a little bit of time. So I'm going to propose, unless anyone has any objection, we get back, let's say at 3:20. That gives us half an hour. And because we have more to cover this afternoon. So let's plan to get back at 3:20 and go forward that way. Does anybody have anything else they want to discuss before we take our break?
One question, Mr. Lilly, and that is it all right if we drop off this Zoom temporarily and rejoin? You just can't join two Zooms at the same time. And I know we may need to get some groups together to talk during the break.
So let me ask, I was wondering the same thing. So can one of my staff, Mr. Anderson or Ms. Blanc, can one of you just go off mute and tell us if people can drop off and drop back on, or is that going to be a problem?
I don't think that's a problem.
Okay, we may have to then manually let you back in, but so it may take a little time, but let's try to do that. And I was actually thinking the same thing. So if you don't have to drop off, and if you don't, it's better because then you're on. But if you need to, then go ahead and do that, and we'll let you back in. So
Thank you.
Okay. So hearing nothing else, we'll go forward. Let's just make it 3:30. We're getting pretty close now to 3 o'clock. So let's make it 3:30 we'll all get back together, try to log on a minute or two early, and I'll try to do the same. So we're ready to go again at 3:30, and we'll see where we are at that point. Okay, so thank you all. Okay, just a moment. We have a couple of people still trying to rejoin. Okay. So it looks like everybody's back. I'm assuming this is the same recording, so I'm not going to do all the introductions I did earlier this afternoon. I talked to my colleagues, and I think I have a plan for how to proceed, but I thought I'd first ask if anyone else wants to report on anything, any proposals or ideas or comments. Does anybody want to say anything before I tell you what I have in mind?
Whatever you think.
Mr. Lilly, I'll report a little bit out of our group, although I'd of course be interested to hear your thoughts, because I know some of it does turn on whether we're doing the transient calibration or steady state. But just as a format in general, we thought there might be some benefit to setting up something along the lines of a once a month meeting, and they can of course meet more frequently if necessary, but with a report out to you.
Who would be in the monthly meetings?
Just the experts, similar to what we had this morning.
Okay. Yeah, I think it might need to be more often than that, but I agree with the concept, just maybe more frequent than that.
And we could leave it up to them to sort of determine frequency, but in the beginning, I think there's some substantive structural issues and the recharge that I heard that they might want to address sort of at the front end of that. And from what we're hearing in terms of timing, it sounds like they would probably need to do this for a number of months, probably, you know, January, February, March, with hopefully wrapping up in April. Although I know a lot can shift and change through the process.
Okay.
And then we'd envisioned at that point, maybe resulting in technical memorandums, one from each side that explained what had been done, sort of the theory, the issues, sort of your standard fare for a technical memorandum, you know, followed by an exchange of data and then some form of hearing. We thought that there's a lot of moving pieces there that we can talk about how to structure, but that type of a format could work very well here.
Okay, that all made sense to me, except for the data exchanges. It seems to me those should be happening earlier on than that. Am I missing something there?
I don't think so. I mean, my guess is that there is going to be data that's going back and forth throughout the process. I think
Okay.
we lawyers always just get nervous and want with the technical memorandum, the full set of whatever's accompanying the technical memorandum.
Excuse me, I'll put final data exchanges then. That might, I think that's what you're getting at. Okay, thank you. Does anybody else want to say anything? I think I may have shell-shocked all of you, so I'm not sure. Oh, there is something. Mr. Osias, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say that our group talked among themselves about a schedule. I didn't know that they thought was doable. It's somewhat similar, but not identical to what you just heard. Do you want to hear that now, or no?
I do want to hear that now. Go ahead.
So I'll let Mr. Leffler and Dr. Ye correct me, but they were thinking that if it's going to be a steady state model and a steady state calibration, that they would be at mid February, and then they'd have a month of scenario runs.
Wait, so what would, excuse me, you broke up. What would be done by mid-February?
The model changes, structural changes, and calibration.
Okay,
And then scenario runs a month, that takes them to mid-March, 2 weeks to prepare a technical memorandum. So that takes them to end of March, beginning of April. And then, of course, some opportunity to review whatever else the other side did.
okay,
If it was going to be transient, which, and you know, we did this anyway, even though we heard your comments, you can add a month to each of those. I mean, the whole thing just moves out 1 month.
at least, yes.
Well,
If
they went
transient-
through it, so they were fairly confident.
Okay, that if it's transient calibration.
Yeah, if it's transient calibration, correct.
Okay. All right, thank you. That is helpful.
And let me just pause to make sure I didn't get that wrong, Dr. Ye. And
Correct.
okay, thank you.
That's the kind of answer we like, short and to the point. Okay, so here's what, and that's good, and thank you. We've heard from Ms. Meisenheimer and Mr. Osias. Does anybody from Marina Coast want to add anything, or will you line up behind the others for now?
We designated Larissa to Ms. Meisenheimer to make our joint presentation here. So
Okay, good. Thank you. I appreciate that. Obviously, to the extent Marina Coast and City of Marina collaborate, it makes it easier for me. So here's what I've decided after conferring with my technical staff. First of all, I do understand the trade-offs between doing what I'm going to call a steady state modeling process during calibration versus a transient process during calibration. And I think here, primarily for time reasons, that it is appropriate for me to direct you to do the calibration process using the steady state modeling. I certainly understand the trade-offs. I think everybody, all the technical people, conceded that there were some trade-offs here. But the two controlling factors in my mind are, number one, the ultimate product is the ultimate model or modified model is can be run in the steady state mode to answer the court's questions. And I heard very clearly, if that was not the case, then a transient calibration would make more sense. But here we have something where I'm pretty confident that what I'm going to call the scenarios can be run in steady state and still answer the court's questions. And because of that, steady state is at least acceptable for the calibration process. And frankly, Dr. Kincaid indicated, may have some benefits just because you could try more different model configurations and see how they work during calibration. So I am directing you to do the steady state approach for the calibration process with the understanding that the steady state will also be done for the modeling of scenarios. So what I would like, I'm starting to feel a little bit like Scrooge, but it's only December 15th and tomorrow will be December 16th. And we did have a hearing date set tomorrow, so I'm not calling you an extra, but I would like the technical experts to meet tomorrow. And frankly, I don't want to lose sight of this. I really do appreciate the constructive work that all six of you were able to do today and to report on. I mean, it's even if you don't agree on everything, this is significant progress that will help make our process go more efficiently, while I think still protecting all of your clients' interests. So I do appreciate that. And I'm going to reward your good work by asking you to do more. And what I'd like you to do is meet tomorrow, and you can decide when to start, although early would probably be good, and to confer and to develop a consensus report on what model modifications you agree you will consider during your process of developing I'll just say of modifying the model and conducting the related calibration process. So I'd like you to give a list of, and I'm not going to try to specify in any more detail than that because I'll get into trouble technically, but the modifications that you agree you at least will consider. And I understand you may not be able to make a final decision by the end of the day tomorrow, which ones will actually bear out fruition. So I'd like that in your report, hopefully a consensus report. If there are areas of disagreement, that will be a problem. But if there are, you can say, well, here's our areas of disagreement, and potentially we can get back to you on our resolution of that. And then I was getting into the proposed schedule, which both Ms. Meisenheimer and Mr. Osias have referred to. But let me talk about what my view is. I would like a report by January 17th, just over a month from now. I understand there are a couple of holidays between now and then, but hopefully there's some work time that you can do in there on a progress report on your model modification and calibration work, and particularly areas of agreement and areas of disagreement. So again, one report prepared by hopefully all 6 experts, or to the extent you're all involved, listing areas of agreement. And if there are areas of disagreement, obviously state, these parties think this should be done, and these parties think, or these people think this should be done, and these people think this should be done. And since we do have a hearing set for starting on January 23rd, I don't want to at least totally give up that date. So I want to come back, all of us together on January 23rd for a report and a discussion on where we are. I understand from what Ms. Meisenheimer was saying, I don't think you're going to have all of the modeling modifications and calibration done by January 17th. It would be great if you could, but if it takes a little more time, I'd rather you take the more time to do that well. And then, so what I was hearing was potentially mid-February. So we'll see where we are on January 23rd. But Mr. Osias said the goal would be mid-February for completing the model changes and related calibration work. Is that correct? Anybody going to dispute that right now? I think that's what I heard.
I believe that. I'm just checking my notes.
Okay.
Yes, mid-February.
And I'll live with that. So then you're doing and frankly, we should definitely have a status report then, even if we don't, it doesn't look like we have any hearing dates then, but I certainly want a status report to find out whether or not that has really happened.
Mr.
and-
Lilly?
Go ahead.
Thank you. I want to make sure I understand sort of what the directives are, because I understand that Mr. Osias did give a timeline that he thought his experts might be able to meet. And I know they've sort of been working with this model for longer and may be able to move a touch faster. I want to make sure I understand what is due in mid-February and whether that's a realistic timeline for our side.
Well, what I would like is to complete the work on the changes to the model and the calibration associated with those changes 2 months from today, or roughly 2 months from today. So I don't know, Dr. Kincaid, is that reasonable?
I think that we're within, let's say, a couple weeks of the same estimation. I think we had generally said that we would be at a similar stage by the end of February. But I think it's a reasonable objective to meet that mid-February goal.
Okay, well, okay. I don't want to push you to go so fast you start making mistakes or sacrifice things, but I do want to keep you making progress. And I certainly think that's the way you're telling me you would like to operate anyway. So we'll leave it at that. So, okay. So I think I can live with Mr. Osias's concept. Hopefully if we end up sliding 2 weeks here, that's not the end of the world, but I hope we don't. But then it would be to run the scenarios. Mr. Osias said mid-February to mid-March. Dr. Kincaid, as prompted by Ms. Meisenheimer, is saying potentially beginning of March to end of March for scenario runs. And then preparing the technical memoranda. I'm going to leave it for the end of March. I'm going to leave the scenario runs for mid-February to mid-March, but with a caveat that if you absolutely can't make it and you have a good explanation as to why and what you're doing, we can move that schedule if we have to. Let's leave it that way. And then we'll put in some time for review for each party to review the other party's complete the technical memos, and then for parties to review one another's, and then we'll talk about setting a hearing date. And we may want to go ahead and set a hearing date. So So what I'd like, This-
So, Mr. Lilly,
go ahead, go ahead.
I was gonna make one minor suggestion that maybe will work for everyone, and that is because I know preparing things for you is also an important task and they get reviewed and all. So if you push the January 17th 1 week and you push the January 23rd 1 week and you push the mid-February 1 week. Now that's half of the extra 2 weeks that Dr. Kincaid said. Then perhaps the delay in reporting to you and appearing for hearings could be more productively used by the experts. And that 1 week off of their estimate that Dr. Kincaid said could now be a more realistic deadline. And not change the stuff later at the end.
Okay, I've started to hear you until you said what you just said. So you would propose the report on basically the progress report on the consensus modeling work, areas of agreement, areas of disagreement. I had said January 17, you're saying January 24. And then our hearing, we do have a hearing date set for
The
January
30th.
31st. I don't think we have I'm not sure. I think we only have the 31st, but we can have the January 31st
Okay.
hearing. So that was good. And then what would you say would be?
And then I was just saying, move off of mid-February by adding 1 week. Because the difference, I think, between our estimate and Dr. Kincaid's was 2 weeks.
Okay, so sometime
So
Not,
I'll come up with a date, but sometime like February 20th or so. I think that might be a holiday, but I'll put or so would be the hopefully completion of the model modification work. Is that
right.
what we're talking about?
Yes.
Model changes and calibration.
Yes.
So status report due then, hopefully saying we have completed that milestone. And if not, here's what needs to be done and here's why. Okay, so then we would do the scenario work during March, start at the end of February, do it during March. At least for now, we'll have the technical memos due. I'll come up with a date in early April for that. And then review period. Sorry, I have to write this down so I can read it. Review period. And then a hearing date. We'll see where we are. This is not sure how this is all going to play out with my phasing into retirement, but I'll figure that out. I told Mr. Woldridge and Miss Graziano they may end up writing this report if I'm gone, which they cringed a little bit at. But internally in my office, we will figure out. There will be people in my office after I retire, so this will get done. If I can, I'll stay on to do this. I hope I can, because it'd really be not nice to dump this on somebody else. Okay, so we can do that. I was going to ask the experts to give a proposed schedule, but I think we've hammered out a proposed schedule. So what I need from the expert witnesses consensus tomorrow is just the report on their plan on what model modifications they agree they will consider. And if there are areas of disagreement, to state those. I'm trying to write this all down. And then after I get that, I will prepare next week a hearing officer's ruling and order setting out the rest of the schedule, but I will track what we have talked about here. So last thing I'm going to ask while I have you all here is, and I just got it, if I can find it here.
I apologize. Did you describe the form of the report you wanted tomorrow? Is it?
Yes. What I want tomorrow from the experts is a report on what model modifications they agree they will consider.
And do you want that by email?
And let me finish.
Oh, sorry.
And if there are areas, I hope there are not areas of disagreement, but if there are areas of disagreement, and then the parties' positions on the areas of disagreement. And that the best way would be that if somebody can send that by email to the Administrative Hearings Office, of course, with CCs for everyone on the service list on that. So is that clear, Mr. Osias?
Yes, I apologize if I asked before I let you do that.
I'm sorry, maybe it was somebody else who asked. But
No, it was me. I didn't mean to interrupt if you were going to get there. So
okay. So
I
is it now clear?
apologize. I missed it. What was the deadline for getting the status report from tomorrow? And is it something that has to go tomorrow or Monday? But I assume you want it promptly. Is that sort of the?
I put a
Guideline.
deadline of tomorrow at 5 p.m.
Okay,
on the grounds that I didn't think the experts were going to want to keep conferring over the weekend. And I'd like to be able to start working on my order Monday morning. I'm not going to work it over the weekend. So I'll put that, but if they're still talking at 5 p.m. and want to keep going, it's okay with me if they do it at 6, but I'd like the experts to prepare the report and send it to me when they stop. So I hate to even say this, but I'm going to say it. If the lawyers spend the weekend working on it, there's going to be more areas of disagreement, and that's what I want to avoid. I said it. You all know what I mean. But so anyway, I'd like to have it by 5 p.m. tomorrow from the experts. And so I can start working on that on Monday morning. I mean, you can talk with the lawyers as you need to, but let's try to get this done. It's fairly short. It's what model modifications the experts agree they will consider, and areas of disagreement, if any, and for the areas of disagreement, the parties' positions on that. So is that, I've rambled a little bit, but is that now clear? And my target is 5 p.m. tomorrow for that by email to the AHO with CCs to everyone on the service list. Okay. So then we have the other dates, which I will memorialize in an order. So if this all works as planned, we would be ready for a hearing in May. And I want to reserve dates because I know how your calendars and mine fill up. So I'm just going to ask May, are there any dates that anybody is not available during May?
Mr. Lilly,
Go
David
ahead.
Osias will be, I'm sorry, May. I looked at April.
May. I just got my new calendar. I still use paper calendars. May 1st is a Monday, so go ahead.
I was going to comment, but I was looking at the wrong month, so I will not comment.
Good enough. Fair enough. Okay, so I will go ahead and block out some dates.
Mr. Lilly.
Oh, man, I thought we were done. Go ahead, Mr. Wilkins.
I know I will not be available the last week in May. Other than that, May is okay.
Okay, well, there is a Memorial Day holiday. So I assume you mean not available May 29 through 31?
I was trying to get my calendar to look that far, and I was struggling to get dates, which is why I was delaying, but that sounds right.
Okay, and I think Ms. Nelson's hand went up. Go ahead, Ms. Nelson.
Yes, my son is graduating from college, and I will not be available between 3, 4, and 5 May.
May available, not available, May 3, 4, and 5?
Correct.
Okay, well, congratulations. I'm sure that's, as we say, a milestone. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And we will, I mean, if you tell me now, I can avoid dates. So I just want to block out dates. So we've got, so we'll target for sometime. We have 2nd, 3rd, and 4th weeks of May still open right now.
So, Mr.
8th through the 26th.
I was wrong. It's the week of the 22nd. Now, I will be beginning of that week. If need be, I can make myself available. It's really the Thursday and Friday that week. I'll be on vacation that whole week, but Thursday and Friday I will truly be unavailable.
So
25th and 26th, I'll be truly unavailable. Otherwise, I'll be on vacation, but I can make myself available.
You make me feel like a Grinch already. All right, so we'll target, unless there's another problem, we'll target 8 through 19.
Mr. Lilly, I just realized my flight comes back on the 8th. Sorry, I'm going to be on an airplane.
All right,
But after that, I'm totally free.
good. We'll target May 9 through, I don't know how many days we're gonna need. Frankly, we didn't take as many as we thought before. I'm gonna target May 9 through 24. And I hope we don't have to interfere with your vacation, Mr. Wilkins, but I want to block out those dates in case we need them all, because I know by the time we get there, your calendars are all gonna, and mine are gonna be a lot fuller. So let's target for that and we'll see where we are. That's what I wanted to ask now. So, okay, so that takes care of that. I think we have a game plan going forward. Thank you very much. I'll look forward to what I hope will be a consensus report tomorrow from the technical witnesses on what model changes they plan to consider. And then I will follow up with my order with a schedule next week. And frankly, I may put in some more reporting milestones. And if we need to have meetings, even if all the attorneys can't participate, I may just go ahead and set those. I mean, all your parties have multiple attorneys representing you. So certainly for status reports, if you can't all attend, that's okay. So anything else on that? If not, I'm going to go forward to my last item. Oh, I will say, I have a fairly detailed outline of the sorts of things that I think should be in the model outputs, but I think it's way early to talk about those. So I'm not going to talk about that now. I mean, frankly, it's pretty much going to track the court's issues. One thing I did want to let you know is while the expert witnesses are working hard on this modeling work and hopefully making progress, I do plan to, on a parallel track, prepare and circulate an outline of the proposed report. Because frankly, a lot of it you can write now, and there's no reason to wait until after a hearing in May to do that. I mean, there's a lot of, I want to have a fairly detailed background discussion. I'm going to ask for people to refer to some DWR, things like DWR Bulletin 118, and just to, I don't think anybody submitted exhibits on this, but I want to have the context of the entire Salinas Valley groundwater basin and the historic DWR basins, and then the groundwater sustainability, whatever they're called, the
GSPs.
The boundaries of each GSA. Is that technically called a groundwater management area, or is it just a GSA boundary area? But anyway, whatever they are, I want to have those. I want to have a background description of the different aquifers, and I'll write this all out in an outline, so you don't need to note this now. And so a fairly detailed background of the history of the geology and hydrogeology, and then of the relevant proceedings, basically including the State Water Board proceedings. And again, it's just a paragraph on each order, and the Coastal Commission and CPUC proceedings. And of course, a very brief discussion of the court's action in this case. So I'm going to hammer out an outline. As I said earlier, I'm going to ask the attorneys to prepare draft reports. And in an ideal world, you would all reach consensus on this. There shouldn't be a reason why you couldn't reach consensus on a statement of facts, which should not have any arguments in it. But if not, you can submit 2 of them. But I want, since we have several months here, I want to have all that prepared and hopefully in good shape. And frankly, we may even be able to I may ask you to prepare text for the draft report on some of the court's issues. There are some of the court's issues that do not rely on modeling. And I may ask you to be preparing reports on those. Of course, the text for the report on the issues that do involve modeling and the ultimate legal issue 8, I will have to wait, but I want to keep that process going forward. So I will alert you to that. And either in the same order or probably a separate order, we'll do that and we'll have deadlines. So the attorneys can be busy working on that while the experts are working on the modeling. So wanted to let you know that's coming. So I've rambled a bit. I apologize. Is there anything else I did want to go over? We have a couple of issues regarding admissibility or admission or acceptance of exhibits, which I did want to circle back to, so I can, if we're done with everything else. So, okay, let me tell you where I am with exhibit. Oh, something else. Mr. Wilkins, go ahead.
Sorry, that was my dogs.
Oh, okay. Well, your dog's not under oath, so he can't testify. So I'm going to go through first the list of Cal-Am exhibits and then Marina Coast exhibits and City of Marina if necessary. So one of the assignments from last week was we have exhibit Cal-Am 98, which is the 2019 Mitigation Monitoring Compliance and Reporting Program. And then I believe we received a different report, which was the actual 2018 Mitigation Monitoring and Reporting Plan, which I think is an MCWD exhibit. Is that correct?
And it's Cal-Am 131.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
That was Mr. Osias.
Thank you, Mr. Osias. So, okay, yes, so that is now received. So, Mr. Osias, do you still want to offer exhibit Cal-Am 98 into evidence?
Not at this time. So let me just take them in sequence. So 131, you asked us to meet and confer with Ms. Musine. We did. She agrees this is the right one.
Okay, maybe we can
Attached
just
to
cover
the
that up
decision.
right now. Can we accept? I don't see Ms. Musine on the line.
Yes, I noticed she wasn't here today, but I have a confirmation email that she doesn't object to this.
I think
She
I
did
saw
say
that
it's,
too.
she says it's the same as a Marina exhibit. I was unable to track it line by line. That wasn't grounds for an objection.
Okay, well, so is there any objection to exhibit Cal-Am 131? Hearing none, that is accepted into evidence right now.
And then on Cal-Am 98,
Yes,
Ms. Musine has said to you and to me that it's not been accepted yet or any order about it. I haven't confirmed the status of it other than we found it on an official site. So I'm not offering it at this time, but I don't want to withdraw it. I want to leave it, if it's okay, subject to further authentication and support. If it's not, going to be an approved part of the project, we won't submit it. But
okay, that's
I
fine.
haven't confirmed that yet.
Yeah, and again, this is just for background information, so don't
Well,
spend a lot
it's
of time.
part
on
of the project description as to what we have to do, because the PUC told us what we have to do if we want to build this project.
Okay, well, if you think it's relevant, then you can offer, and you think you can authenticate it, then you can do that later. So it's not
Right.
accepted now, but potentially subject to being ruled on later.
Right.
Okay, so that's fine. So that gets us to Cal-Am 118, which was the Coastal Commission staff report, which we deferred. And then 119 relates to this, which is the Coastal Commission addendum to the staff report. And I think I'd said before that I do want to have these in the record as for background information, certainly not that we're going to rely on them, but I'd like to be able to have our report be able to state that this is what the Coastal Commission staff stated, and that would be as far as we would go. So subject to that, well, I'll just say, does anybody have any objections to my accepting Cal-Am 118 and 119 into evidence?
Yes, as exhibits, I believe that I referenced last time, I have no problem with them being judicially noticed as documents for part of the historical background, but there was reference to change the project description, which we disagree with. there was reference to a number of things that it says that we disagree with. So I would have a problem with it being evidence. I, again, do not have any problem with you taking official notice of the document and referencing it in the background section. I'm not.
Okay, so I accept exhibits Callan 118 and 119 into evidence on the grounds that I think even though it's by staff, we can take official notice of them, but they are accepted for the limited purpose of being able to, for parties to be able to use to describe what the Coastal Commission staff stated about the project, but not for any purpose beyond that. And frankly, I hope at some point, let me just finish, at some point, I hope we do have the order the Coastal Commission adopted. I think it was last month, whenever it was recently. And again, that we can take official notice of, and I want to be able to cite that in our background section as well. So go ahead. Was there somebody who wanted to say something?
Yeah, Mr. I was going to remind you that when we had this colloquy last time, you said almost exactly what you just said.
I'm glad I'm more or less consistent.
And Mr. Wilkins said exactly what he just said. And our position was that there was an order approving the project, and that order is not yet reduced to writing. And when it is, we intend to submit it. And we think it will have a control over the project description, because we can't build a project that's inconsistent with the Coastal Commission approval. And at that point, we will ask you to admit it. And if it attaches 118 and 117, those as well as part of the project description. If it has something else, we won't. We'll adapt to what it says. But it's not, the written decision that you're asking about has not been released yet by the commission.
All right, so when it is, if you can submit it to the AHO, either probably best to upload it to your exhibit folder and send us an email advising you that you've done that, because we don't check those folders unless we get an email from you. And of course, include everyone on the service list as CCs. I'll tell you right now, I think it's pretty clear what I'm going to do. I'm going to take official notice that the Coastal Commission adopted this order on this date. And beyond that, people can refer to it as to what it states or doesn't state. But I think that's we will take official notice of it for that purpose. Beyond that, I'm not sure what evidentiary value it has. But you're right, Mr. Osais, it may have relevance to the project description because it is an order that would affect the project description. But I don't know that it will have a big bearing beyond that. I mean, for example, I don't know what's in it, but I doubt it will have much effect on our decisions on the issues the court referred to us beyond just stating it, background information. But I may be wrong because the project description may end up having a bearing that way. So anyway, is that clear for now?
Yes, and I think that's what you said before. And that's how we'll proceed.
Okay, now Exhibit Callan 120 is a memorandum dated 2022 11.11, November 11th of this year. EKI memorandum to Rem Schertzinger from Ina Wang and Vera Nelson. I haven't had a chance to look at it. I know this was briefly referred to by, I think it was Mr. Betts during cross-examination, Ms. Nelson. And Mr. Osais, did Callan offer that? I think Callan has offered that into evidence. Is that correct?
I believe so, and I think it was for impeachment. And I apologize that Mr. Betts, who was addressing these issues, wasn't able to be here.
That's fine. Mr. Moore is raising his hand. Do you have anything to say about this exhibit, Mr. Moore?
Yeah, Ms. Lilly, I think I used it with Ms. Nelson. I mean, and I used it for cross-examination. I also used it for impeachment. If we recall, we were dealing with a letter that she sent to Mr. What's his name? And so I think that's the reason why I use it, certainly. And I think it doesn't make a lot of difference, because if I wasn't offering it for the truth of the matter asserted, meaning it really wasn't used for a hearsay reason. So you're ruling in terms of is coming in for what's in that document is fine for either reason. But certainly for impeachment, if she said she hadn't seen it, if you recall, and she had seen it. So that's one of the reasons it comes in, but it comes in under a different category, non-hearsay.
Okay, so Mr. Wilkins or anybody else from Marina Coast, any objections to this exhibit coming in for that purpose?
I mean, yes, to the extent it's actually impeachment evidence, because Ms. Nelson specifically testified that she never saw the Coastal Commission staff report. She repeated that in her testimony in this proceeding, as she had in her deposition. She did note in her deposition and in this proceeding that she had seen the conditions in the staff report. She didn't realize it.
Okay, you're going way beyond what we need to.
I just don't
have
think,
any
I don't
objection to
think
this.
there's any impeachment here, is my point.
Okay,
Oh.
so the objection is overruled. The exhibit is accepted into evidence for the limited purpose that Mr. Moore has described. Okay, we next have exhibit Cal-Am 127 is the MCWD cross complaint. And I think this is one that MCW, I think we already have in our files the amended cross complaint, but the purpose of having the cross complaint come in simply was because it was an earlier date when I'm going to remember the name if I get it wrong. I want to say interface zone, but I don't think that's right. What is the zone called where the wells are? Is it interface zone or is it?
Yeah.
something?
So that's how they named it, yes.
Okay, so the only reason this would come in, I mean, again, it's in this court's proceeding. So I think it can come into our record for that purpose. And I wanted to have the original cross complaint original MCWD cross complaint, because that was the first time my understanding is the definition of interface zone was presented. So is there any objection to it coming into being accepted into evidence for that purpose?
I have a note here that we argued this last time and that the ruling was not admitted, but that it went into the background documents. I don't know if others have that notation.
That's what I understood, but I don't have a real big issue with it for the limited purpose.
Okay, yeah, that's. I noted here with the original, the ruling was deferred. So let's do that. It's not accepted into evidence here, but we will add it to our background documents folder where we have several other pleadings in this action, which is a logical place for it to go.
But it is evidence of the first time that phrase was used, and we can say such in our pleadings. I mean, in our argument. Okay.
Just as if you were in court in front of the judge in this case, you could cite in your brief, Your Honor, as discussed in Marina cross complaint, this is the first time this phrase was used.
Yeah.
I think the court can take, I don't know whether it's judicial notice or something else, but the court certainly can review the documents in its own file in the same case. So we will leave it at that. Okay. Then we have last two excerpts. Exhibit Cal-Am 130 was excerpts from the transcript of the deposition of Dr. Trudell. Does anybody have any objection to that being accepted into evidence?
We would have a request that several pages be added to it. And I know we're not fully following the rules of evidence here, but there is evidence code section 356, which is the rule of completeness, which I could read out, but I don't think I'll bore everyone at this point in the evening.
You don't need to.
The pages 169 through 171 should be added into this. The way that—
I'm sorry, what were those page numbers? 16?
The 169 through
Okay.
171. And the way that the transcript was used at the deposition, there were frequently clips that were played where if you looked a few lines up, Dr. Trudell had given the very answer that he was, allegedly being impeached on. And so from our perspective, in order to have actually the full colloquy in, at the very least, we need to add those pages.
Okay, so is that your only objection?
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to accept exhibit Cal-Am 130 into evidence. And Ms. Meisenheimer, it's just easier for me to keep track of it this way. If you want to offer a separate Marina exhibit with those additional pages, just do that. You know the drill. Upload it to our to the Marina folder of exhibits and send us an email. And I'll tell everyone right now, I'm going to go ahead and accept that into evidence because I think your argument about completeness has merit. And we'll put it in, but that way, I mean, you'll have to cite the two different exhibits, but I think it's going to be clear for my record to make it clear who offered what.
And if it's all right with Your Honor, I'll include the pages that are right before and after that we're sort of completing so that you don't have half of it in one and half in the other. We'll just have the full series.
And it's fine with me if you want to just submit an exhibit that has all the pages of 130. Well, you decide. The way you described it probably makes the most sense. So do it that way.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair
And
game.
Mr. Lilly, if we had an objection, we would just send it in as if the page, and it would be along the lines of, well, that page has something to do with something else, but I don't expect that, but I just want to preserve the right to do that.
Of course, just do that in a reply to all email if
Yeah.
after you get Ms. Meisenheimer's email advising that she's filed it. Okay, that's all I have on Cal-Am exhibits. Are there any other Cal-Am exhibits we need to consider? Okay, let's go to Marina Coast exhibits. I tried to do this ahead of time, so I'm sort of prepared. We had an exhibit MCWD 16 is a geoscience technical memorandum regarding the Monterey Peninsula Water Supply Project, which was submitted to the Hydrologic Working Group on April 20th, 2015. And I'm trying to remember, I have a note here, I deferred ruling on that.
Yeah,
Does
so-
anybody from Cal-Am have a statement regarding that? I'm sorry that Mr. Betts is not here, but I need, because I think he was the one that raised the issue before.
Mr. Lilly, this is Mr. Wilkins. On all the exhibits, the remaining exhibits, which I can list them, I did confer, sent an email to Mr. Betts. He did respond, not in time for us to include it in our status report that we sent you on Wednesday, but he did respond that he was, the exact words, and Mr. Osias and Mr. Donald were on this email, that we will not object. So my understanding is they're no longer objecting to all the documents that we discussed that you deferred ruling on. And obviously Cal-Am can correct me if I've misrepresented.
Okay,
Mr.
good.
Wilkins is correct.
Thank you. I appreciate. So exhibit MCWD 16 is accepted into evidence. I'll see what else I mean, these were various technical reports.
These are the reference reports, and we wanted to confirm that they in fact were referenced.
That's fine. So exhibit MCWD 73 is accepted into evidence.
I have 19 and 20, 21, 43, 65. and
Wait, don't talk so fast.
Right.
19, 20, what?
19 and 20 were next.
Okay, my records show those have already been admitted into evidence. So they're in. Go ahead. What else?
21,
21 already admitted.
43,
Already admitted.
65.
And this all is in our spreadsheet that we have posted, by the way. I'm not just making this up. 65. My records. Oh, that's deferred. I missed my circle on that. So exhibit MCWD 65 is now accepted into evidence.
And 99.
All right, exhibit MCWD 73 is now accepted into evidence. Now I'm caught up with you, Mr. Wilkins. Let me keep going now.
And 99.
Wait. One at a time. I do have 99. Exhibit MCWD 99 is accepted into evidence. And go ahead.
I said, I think that's all of them. Am I missing one?
Okay, the only other ones I have are, we have Dr. Kincaid's spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet, which exhibit MCWD 120. I think Cal-Am wanted to have time to look at that, but unless there's any objection, I'm going to accept that into evidence. That's accepted into evidence. And exhibit MCWD 122 is Dr. Kincaid's updated Excel spreadsheet, so I accept that into evidence as well. I have MCWD 121.
That's the supplemental report, and that's just the way you directed him to file all this, if I recall correctly.
This is groundwater. Well, this is the groundwater sustainability plan, appendix 6B. Oh, groundwater model flow documentation. I don't remember. Was that from Dr. Kincaid, or was that from somebody else? Do you remember, Mr. Wilkins?
Oh, you didn't get into this. So that one was one that we were potentially going to get into if we were going to debate the calibration, and you said you didn't want to hear it, so we did not seek to introduce that document at this time.
All right, so we'll leave it. It may come up later, but not introduced for now.
Mr. Liu, my recollection was, in fact, you asked for that to be introduced because we gave us the right on certiorari rebuttal, which I'm not sure where that stands at the moment, to discuss relative calibration standards, guidelines, rules of thumb, whatever you want to call them, especially in the area from other reports. So this,
Okay,
I think, was the
Mr.
calibration
Osai-
work for the GSP and for the Monterey Subbasin.
All right, so what I recommend is you make a note of this. When you get into your next round of submissions with the technical memoranda that we're talking about for roughly the end of March, if you think, and actually I had this in my notes as well, if you think evidence regarding industry standards for calibration is relevant in terms of, I'll just say, published reports or things like that, or, gosh, I hate to open up the door on this, I mean, the door being a can of worms, but let's say if there still are issues regarding the breadth or accuracy of calibration after this new modeling work and calibration work has been done, I will give parties an opportunity to submit evidence related to that issue at that time. But at that point, Mr. Osai, if you want to offer this document, you can just make it a CalAm exhibit and offer it down the road. So let's do it that way. Hopefully, the new modeling work will improve the calibration so the experts have agreement on that. But if they don't, then that potentially is a very relevant issue for consideration down the road. So does that make sense, Mr. Osai?
It does, and might I suggest also, just along those lines, because we've taken a tack. I'm using a sailing term. You know, we're sort of gone a different direction a little bit as a result of the experts collaborating. The record now does not contain the certiorari rebuttal testimony from our experts disputing some of the things that were raised on certiorari rebuttal, or that came up anew in the live testimony from the other side. That may or may not be particularly relevant to the outcome anymore, given what we're now focused on. And I do think it's far better for the experts to focus on the task that you've assigned.
Good.
Than putting that together. But I don't want the record to be deficient of that if it matters, or to have waived the opportunity to at least note that they have contrary opinions and evidence to some of the criticisms leveled in that phase. And we were headed down a path of how and when should it be presented when we determined to go this route. So
right. Okay.
I'm not objecting to this route, but I don't want to lose that fact, nor do I want it to, because of absence, look like there's a concession that our experts say everything they were criticized for is correct.
Okay. Well, it's probably good you just noted that. That certainly was my understanding, was that the CalAm experts wanted to be able to respond. And that's what prompted me to take this other approach, which I think is going to get us to more progress. I mean, the problem I have with that approach is then inevitably the Marina Coast and City of Marina experts would want to respond back, and it could be sort of an infinite process, or might not ever reach closure. So, but having said that, we're going down this process, which I think we all agree will be preferable. But if there are disputes down the road, then parties can respond. You know, I disagree with this other party's expert on this point, and here's why. And I think we'll be able to do that. I hope we can reach closure down the road. But your point is noted, Mr. Osai. I'm hoping that issue will be superseded by the new modeling work. But if it's not, you can bring that point up again later. Is that, so you've
And
made your
that's
point, and I
fine.
give you the right to reserve your right to raise that later if necessary.
Okay.
So let's
Thank you.
leave it at that. Okay, City of Marina exhibits. I think we don't have any pending issues. Mr. Spalding or Ms. Meisenheimer, are there any pending issues regarding any of the City of Marina exhibits?
I don't believe there are any pending issues. I think we're set.
Okay, good. And we have posted these, I print them, but they're posted in each party's exhibit file in the AHO FTP folder. There is an Excel file listing the party's exhibits. Sometimes you have to scroll all the way down to the end, but you can check those. We will update it with these rulings. Mr. Anderson's, I'm sure, has been diligently taking notes, and he's very efficient at updating the spreadsheets, but you might want to check. So we'll give him tomorrow to do that. We're getting pretty late today. But you can just check tomorrow or Monday as necessary and see if you think there's anything we've missed. But I do try to keep accurate lists of the exhibits and my rulings on them, just to, we have so many exhibits, it just helps us maintain a little control over those. Okay, so let me just check my notes. I had quite a few notes on the modeling work, but I'm not going to go over those. I think at this point, I've given my comments enough for the parties technical experts to go forward and do what they're planning to do. So I'm done for today. Where we are right now is we're scheduled to come back in a month and a half on January 31st. If for some reason we have to have a status conference sooner, if I think we need one, I'll let you know. If any of you think so, you know how to let me know. But otherwise, that's our plan. I really do hope the technical experts can continue to work constructively together and make some progress on these modeling issues. So anything else for today?
Happy holidays.
Okay, and we're not going to meet tomorrow. So everybody do enjoy the holiday season, although I want the experts to keep working. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist, but everybody have a good holiday season and New Year, and I will see you all on January 31st, if not sooner. Thank you and
Thank
goodbye.
you. Have a good holiday.
Thank you, Mr.
everyone.
Lilly.
Happy holidays.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, and happy holidays to everyone as well.